Good morning to you all. This is a little different from yesterday, but I'm going to start from where I left off, I hope. Winning hearts and minds, something different. And this is dedicated to Siri Nergard, who was with us yesterday, is not here, and she's through that video camera. I'm not going to win her heart, but I'm going to try to win her mind by looking at this. Siri, as you might know, is the high priestess of post-translation studies. Officialized, institutionalized as the position of the NIDA Institute, apparently. And I have issues with that. But I'm going to try to explain my position with respect to post-translation studies, working from this fan, which we saw yesterday. I took it from James Holmes. And I explained yesterday, 2 days ago, that we could rewrite the two axes here, which seek to define translation as a crossover point, in terms of many different things. Now, post-translation studies, such as I understand it, wants to study all of that and not just the crossover, not just translation in a narrow prescriptive sense or what appears to be the Western sense, if seen from Vietnam. It wants to study all of that. It might be all the uses of multiple languages and all the uses and commentaries of a text. But you could quite easily make that semicircle into a full circle or into a sphere by adding the dimensions. And you want to study all of that. So do I. So do I. I really feel the need to go beyond that focus on the translation form, and even to question it. I remind you that 2 days ago, the translation form, when tested against Habermas's pragmatics, his ethics for validity claims, only scored 1 out of 3. And many of the other forms available can score better and perhaps be more ethical. More than that, I think the Bible translation people among us are confronting a problem of trying to go beyond the binary divisions. If we're not fully satisfied with dynamic, do we therefore have to go back to formal? Is that the only way we can go? Does relevance theory push us back to the other side? Are we going forward or backwards? I think this view of looking at cross-cultural communication and all the things that are done around it can help solve that problem. That is, post-translation studies may have a definite role to play here. That is, if your translation is somewhere there and it's extremely opaque, formal, not speaking to people, the communities themselves usually develop alternative forms. I remember some years ago in Iguazu pointing out that my favorite preacher, Crespo Dollar. Is he Crespo Dollar? Yeah. Creflo? Yeah. Brilliant speaker in the United States, uses the King James Version precisely because his congregation does not understand it. Therefore, they require him to explain it. Okay? The use of the text compensates for what the text is not good at. And vice versa. If you start from an extremely adaptive, dynamic version, the community may eventually realize the discrepancies with other available versions and may require a translation that is closer or philologically more exact or more explanatory. That is, historically, there's this process of adjustment where the translations move, and move not just in relation to other translations. Goethe, you remember, claimed that the community needs 3 translations, not just within that limited frame, but with respect to everything else that is done around the text. One of my favorite examples is a study by Claggett of Euclid being translated from Arabic into Latin in 12th century Spain. Hispania, Spain didn't exist. And Claggett got together the manuscript tradition. Establishing a text is hard work for medievalists. It's detective work. But he found that, in fact, there had been at least 3 traditions within the manuscripts. There was something very close to the Arabic text, which nobody understood because they were writing out numbers in Latin without the Arabic numerals. At that stage, it was very, very hard to follow what was happening. Then there was an obvious pedagogical text for use in teaching situations that took the proofs out. And then there was a final text which adopted the numbers and put the proofs back in. And you could see from this diversity of the manuscripts that the text had been dealt with. Because it was incredibly difficult at the beginning, the community found ways of translation and retranslation and reordering and editing even to make sense with it, to absorb eventually Euclid in that particular case. Now, my simple point on Monday was that this is a very good thing to do, to widen what we're going to look at in all fields, not just Bible translation, all fields of translation. But let's not forget that there is that little bugbear there called, or I called, the translation form. It may not be a very good thing, but it's there, and we have to come to terms with it. So my personal position is I'm going to use the term translation for that, and I'm going to look for other terms. It also helps me talk with the practitioners. To use the common term translation for the common thing called translation helps the transfer of knowledge and insight and helps exchange between practice and research. I just added in a footnote, my problem is not theory or theorizing. My problem is doing research and getting the results of research to the people who can use it and getting the practitioners on the side of research to help us discover things together. It's not a theory practice thing. It's a research community, practitioner community, collaboration that I'm seeking. So that's my position. We agree on where we want to go. I just disagree on the terms we use to get there. And that may be a minor thing. Now to things that are frontline interest. I'm going to talk about Arizona. I was there recently, and I moved to Afghanistan. This is House Bill 2281. You might have heard of the Arizona legislature having interesting laws about, for example, racial profiling. I was a group of stupid academics lost on the outskirts of Tucson, Arizona. Americans don't drive anywhere. So you say, how far is a restaurant? They say 10 minutes. And we Europeans say, 10 minutes walking. No. We're out on the desert, cactuses. And the police stop. I mean, if you look like you are a possibly illegal immigrant in Arizona, the police not only can but are obliged to stop you and ask to see your papers. Okay? This is one of the laws. And this goes hand in hand with laws like this one, which effectively outlaws the teaching of ethnic studies. Okay, so the Mexican community cannot go to school in Arizona and learn about Mexican culture, or Korean, or whatever. Okay? Now, there's huge debate, and there was huge debate when I was there, but strangely enough, nobody got back and looked at the actual law, which was approved. And it's so brief and so dense, very dense, and poetic even, pithy. Let's read it. Just down the bottom. A school, shall not include any course or class that, 1, promotes the overthrow of the United States government. Okay, I'll give you that one. I mean, if you're paying, you don't want to be, fair enough. I mean, 2, promotes resentment toward a race or class of people. Okay, that sounds good. I'll sign up for that one too. I don't think we should be teaching resentment. 3, are designed primarily for pupils of a particular ethnic group. Do tell. Why not? 4, advocates ethnic solidarity instead of the treatment of pupils as individuals. And here, the bit of me that's still European or trying to become European, I don't know quite what, I'm Australian born, okay, says, wait a minute, solidarity for me is a good thing. And here, it's a bad thing. And solidarity is opposed to the individual. And I've got here a fundamental view of what a society can be or should be. A collection of individuals in the absolutely liberal, in the European sense, state, okay? Or a group of ethnic identities, okay? And here the choice is for one. Why do they go for the individual instead of the ethnic groups? Well, if you read the implicatures in reverse, it stands to reason, and it's very logical to the people who voted for it in any case, that if you have a class for ethnic solidarity, that will only be for the people of the ethnic group, but surely it doesn't have to be a closed shop. You know, like they still do divide kids up according to their religion, you're going to divide them up according to their home language, which is a dubious thing. I have a son who does go to school in California, and we had to fill out the form. What are your home languages? We put, well, English, Spanish, Catalan. What's Catalan? Sort of Spanish. Right, you're going into the bilingual education class. Oh, no, he speaks English. He speaks English. Okay, it is problematic, and I've been through the problematic aspects of applying this kind of policy, which is based on ethnic group or home language in many cases. The debate, I think, is at too low a level. And I think to address that kind of question and relate it to translation, you have to debate with somebody a bit intelligent. Interestingly enough, in Europe, that precise question has been framed in terms of translation. In the German tradition, in German and Austria, Translationssoziologie is a view of a postmodern society composed of different ethnic groups who communicate with each other not directly, but in a translational way. That is, the democracy requires communication between groups. You cannot assume homogeneity as you can with a collection of individuals. You must recognize ethnic differences and linguistic differences, and the abstract model for that is translation. Translationssoziologie does not study translations in the sense that brought us here together today. It's trying to figure out how different groups communicate within the one democratic society. Interesting, provocative use of the term translation. I simply put it there. Do not confuse it with sociologie de la traduction, which is another name for actor network theory, which also does interesting things with the term translation, but is not addressing that particular problem. As on Monday, much of my engagement with this problem has been through reading Habermas. Not from the position of a sympathetic reader, of agreeing with. It's very much debating with. Habermas has thought very seriously about this specific problem in a series of texts in the mid-1990s, and takes it upon himself to accept the fact of multicultural societies and yet defend democracy, defend the European nation-state democracy based on communication in which people have veracity claims. And he deals with some very problematic aspects, and I think this is an intelligent debate. I mean, I must agree that the model of society, it's not hard to find. I worked on 12th century Hispania. The 12th and 13th century Spain had different ethnic groups, different language communities, different laws for each language community. And as much as history says they got on wonderfully well together, they didn't. They had frequent struggles, persecutions, massacres, the king of the three religions, often, periodically took to throwing one or other out of his realm. However, it's not an ideal model. It's a difficult thing to work on. Habermas picks up the case of the Amish. You know the Amish in the United States, particularly in Pennsylvania? Amish, thank you. You're going to have to correct me because I'm... There's these guys who have the long beards and they don't have cars, right? And they, at least the time that Habermas is writing about them, the Amish want their kids to go to school only to grade 8. Okay? 8 years of schooling, and that's it. And they say, our culture prohibits them from going to public schooling beyond grade 8. And whatever it is, I don't think it's a constitution, but it must be law in Pennsylvania, says you've got to be there to the age of 14 or something, or more. So it's a question of having 2 more years of school or not. And they claim cultural specificity as a reason for not having this 2 extra years of school. And the claim of democracy, which is a serious thing in the United States, and requires participation in public communication, says you need those extra 2 years in order to fully participate in the democracy. And it's a very good question. It's very hard to answer that question. Are we going to allow a culture to not send kids to school in the interests of cultural specificity, or are we going to impose the principles of our democracy? And I don't know how to answer that. In the abstract, it's difficult. But my answer as a scholar to that sort of problem is to look at what people do. Like yesterday, 2 days ago, I said, well, look at the problems in Les Fleurs du Mal, if you have look at the practice. The Amish, like the Mexicans in Tucson, don't have to decide one or the other. What languages do they speak? Do you know? Pennsylvania German, right. They have, within their own community, their own language. They also have Hochdeutsch. They have High German because the Bible is in High German. Okay, so they're already bilingual there. And they cultivate very good English for speaking with the outside community. So that if you have Amish talking and a non-Amish comes along, they'll switch automatically to English, and you'll think that that German stuff isn't really happening there. But if you look at that use of 3 languages, they are already negotiating multiple allegiances. They are not, and they're not stupid either. They do take their democratic responsibilities seriously. Okay? Same with the Mexicans around Tucson that I saw, Spanish at home, English in the school. Just a simple fact of multilingualism and polyglot people says the choice is not between one and the other. In language and in culture, you can have and. People do it all the time. Most of the world is polyglot, polylingual, they say, has many, many languages, okay, and moves between them. Most cultures are set up that way. And I think the problem with the law and the thinking that goes behind the law, or even the problem between the debate such as Habermas set it up, overlooks the cunning, the ruse, the practical knowledge that linguistic communities develop. And a lot of the problems with translation theory, to read this back, is that we assume a monolingual community that we're working for. Very often, it's not the case. That kind of view of the world brings me to something called inculturation. But first I'll introduce it with a piece of history. In 1524-25, a group of missionaries went to what's now Mexico and set out to learn the language. I think Nahuatl in this case, and this is what the Cronista, the historian, says. How did they start to learn a language? It's a Quinean situation. How do you start to learn a language when you know nothing about it? Their solution was to play with the children. Why? Because They had fun and made jokes with the children, and they became children with the children. They became Indians with the Indians. Because children were the teachers of the evangelizers. Is that a word? Evangelists, thank you. Evangelists, yes. Why don't I translate this for you in here? Children were also the preachers, and the children became the ministers of the destruction of idolatry. We might add, the children thereby became the ministers of the destruction of their native culture. This is a chapter in a book where I try to answer the simple question, why do people speak Spanish in Mexico? Now, think about it. This original context situation, such as we have it described here, is a multilingual translation zone, point of contact, things are happening. But what do they do? What's the end result? Admittedly, over 3 centuries or so, what happened? They brought down the government of Moctezuma. Might it? Playing with children might indeed bring down the government of the United States. Wait a minute. Wait a minute. What happens when we look at translation or this kind of problem on the level of centuries, and we start to realize that much as we proclaim a sort of innocence in our activity, the movements of languages and the acts of translation do indeed change the fundamental configurations of cultures, moving one into the other, over the other, incorporating within the other, the whole movement of imperialism, colonialism, missionary activities even. I have doubts about the posts. I think on Monday, I hope I demonstrated that you can incorporate what's called post-structuralism, the loss of a transcendental signifier. You can talk about translation without referring to equivalence or meanings. I did that on Monday. I can accept that post. The other kinds of posts where everything is everything, I have doubts about, but that's because I want to remain an intellectual. But the other post, the post-colonialism thing, now that is intriguing. Now that, if you formulate these problems on that level, that does become a good kind of post to bring on board and relate to translation, but not proclaiming some kind of innocence as if we were not engaged in this activity. The Catholic Church, such as it is, does not proclaim innocence, happily. I've been engaged in the past few years with the translation policies of the Vatican, and intrigued, by the way, from the 1980s, it's moved from what we would otherwise call dynamic equivalence in Comme le Prévoit, which does promote adapting the Word of God to the local cultures, through to a very conservative position that we have today with the current Pope. I'm not a Catholic. I really look at this from the outside as somebody rather bemused by the texts and intrigued at the intelligence behind them. Now, you'll find John Paul II in 1985 already thinking about translation in terms of cultural movements. This is not something academics have come up with through some miraculous cultural turn. What's happening there?